along with Diana. So we have two virtual participants, and the rest are on the podium. So I can see you on your screen. So today's welcome to today's event at the Food and Agriculture Pavilion, co-organized by the CGIAR. The title of today's event is The State of Agri-Food System in a Climate Crisis and the Role of IPCC, IPBES, and Other Global Assessments in this. Just a small background, we already know that the world's poor heavily rely on agri-food systems for their livelihoods, and agri-food systems are highly vulnerable to climate change. And we also know that agri-food systems contribute to up to a third of greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to reduce those emissions, various options exist. Those options have been evaluated, have been assessed by the previous IPCC report, but they don't always align with sustainable development goals like zero hunger. So given that global scientific assessment bodies like IPCC and IPBES can help assess sustainable transition pathways that do not compromise food and environmental security for the poorest, particularly in the global south. And in this context, scientific organizations like the CGIAR can provide an evidence base for these assessments. Given the kind of complementarity between the assessments and the scientific organizations like ours, this session brings in the senior leadership from the IPCC, IPBES, the CGIAR, and representatives from developed and developing country negotiator group to discuss some of these issues. My name is Dr. Aditi Mukherjee. I am the director of CGIAR's Climate Impact Platform. And with me, I have an extremely illustrious panel that I have a great privilege of introducing today. I would be moderating this session, and my colleague Debbie, who is there in person, will be assisting with cues about when time is about to be over. If we can share the screen and show the program, but I can read it out if that's not up on the screen. The first one would be, we will have around 5 minutes of setting the scene by Dr. Patrick Caron. Patrick is the CGIAR System Board Vice Chair. Patrick is also the Vice President for International Affairs at the University of Montpellier and International Director of Montpellier University of Excellence. Patrick will first deliver his welcome remarks. That would be then followed by a panel discussion. There are no presentations planned in this session. In the panel discussion, we have 5 speakers. We have Professor Jim Ski, who is the chair of IPCC's AR7 assessment cycle, Jim was elected IPCC chair for the 7 assessment cycle in July 2023. In the AR6 cycle, Jim was the co-chair of the working group 3, which looks at mitigation. And he was also professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London. Our second panelist today is Dr. David Obura. David is the IPBES chair. He's the founding director of Cordio East Africa, a knowledge organization supporting sustainability of coral reef and marine systems in Western Indian Ocean, and is based in Kenya. Our third panelist, who has joined us online, hello Diana. Diana is the IPCC vice chair in AR7. And in the AR6 cycle, she has served as a vice chair of Working Group 3. She's a professor at the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy at the Central European University. Welcome, Diana. Our fourth panelist is Dr. George Wamukoya. He is the team leader for AGNES. AGNES is the African Group of Negotiator Expert Support, and he's a lead negotiator on agriculture. And Dr. Yamukoya is based in Nairobi, and he also assisted in the establishment of climate change unit at the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. And our final panelist, the last but not the least, is our new Executive Managing Director of the CGIAR, Dr. Ismahane Elaufi. Ismahane has taken over the role of the Executive Managing Director of the CGIAR effective 1st of December. And she previously held the position of Chief Scientist at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United States. And she was also the Director General at the International Center for Biosaline Agriculture in UAE. And finally, the last part of the program would be closing remarks by His Royal Highness Prince Jaime de Bourbon de Parma, who is the climate envoy of the Netherlands. So with that introduction, I would now invite our Vice Chair of the CGIAR System Board, Dr. Patrick Caron, to provide his welcome remarks. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you. Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, great. Great. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, friends, welcome. Welcome to this great moment. Well, science and innovation is about understanding the world around us and mobilizing this knowledge to tackle the pressing challenges. Without science, our attempts to navigate the complexity of multiple crises are just guesswork. 10 years ago, just 10 years ago, we could not have imagined a meeting like today's, bringing together those working on food systems and agriculture with climate change and biodiversity experts. Agriculture was considered the enemy because it emits 1/3 of greenhouse gases, because it's responsible for 70% of biodiversity loss. Environment, in its turn, was considered a scarecrow for economic activities. But well, we are now together to explore the way to address interconnected crises in a consistent way. And this is made possible as food systems are increasingly recognized as one major lever towards sustainability, as discussed during the UN Food System Summit and earlier this week. This calls for pooling collective intelligence from different sources to address trade-offs, to address obstacles to change, which is not easy, how we are used to work in silos. No more institution pooling collective intelligence. For example, to square the circle and ensure that efforts to reduce emissions and maintain biodiversity do not increase the vulnerability of those who are left behind. More than ever, the world needs the science and knowledge assessed and generated by panels like IPCC, IPBES, and my own organization, CGIAR. From identifying transition pathways to contributing to the desired innovations, our organizations complement each other in advancing the necessary, just, and equitable transformation. We can together prepare the journey to the unknown and think the unthinkable, hopefully for the better. But it's no simple task, and there is a long way to go. I'm delighted that we have today with us some of the world's leading scientists and climate experts and champions to discuss the gaps in knowledge today and the way to move beyond polarization of position and knowledge fragmentation. We will also hear how scientists, particularly those from the global south, can better participate in global knowledge generation and scientific assessments, such as the one carried out by IPCC and IPBES. And from this session, I hope we will gain some insight into the scale of the challenge of transforming food, land, and water systems, which is the new CGIAR strategy, to meet climate, biodiversity, health, and security goals. I hope we will also take heart in the existing opportunities to invest in advancing science and innovation for such a transition. This October, we brought together some of you to start the process of designing a joint roadmap to strengthen science policy interfaces with a S. Together with the University of Montpellier, we at CGIAR will convene a large international event in March next year to make further progress, to improve the knowledge ecosystem efficiency, agree on a common vision, milestone and roadmap, fully mobilizing expert panels and the whole science, policy, society ecosystem. CGIAR will continue to engage with global expert panels, not only to participate in global assessment, as in the case of moderator Aditi Mukherjee and many others, but also to host expert meetings and to support decision-making and to contribute to shape a safe space for pooling collective intelligence, because with science, we can. Finally, we must also recognize the importance of nuance and diversity. Transforming food, land, and water system in the climate crisis must be human-centric and customized to specific contexts, not just globally relevant. This also requires diversity in our science. I look forward to be inspired by our esteemed speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for very nicely setting the scene. The way this session will organize, and it's a little unusual because usually the moderator is in the room for a very particular circumstance. I am not. So please bear with us for this session. The way we will do it is we will have 2 rounds of questions and answers. Each of the panelists will around have 4 to 5 minutes to answer those questions. And then we will conclude and draw the lessons. So with that, I direct my first question to Professor Jim Ski. So Jim, you know, AR6 had a special report on land where agriculture was covered. And then agriculture was also covered in Working Group 2 and Working Group 3, one focused on adaptation and another on mitigation. Now, the thing is that as mitigation progresses in other sectors, and we are seeing that mitigation is progressing in energy to a large extent and transport to a certain extent, it is inevitable that attention will shift to agriculture and agri-food system. So in that context, my question here is, what are those major knowledge gaps that emerge from AR6? That's something that our scientists within the CG system, but scientists worldwide should work so that we have a solid contribution to AR7. So the question is really around knowledge gaps and where should this literature now move so that AR7 has enough access. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, Aditi, and I hope you don't mind me standing at the podium. It means I can see everybody in the room, which assures me quite a lot. So Aditi's mentioned the special report on climate change in land, and it was actually the first IPCC report that thought in terms of the food system as a whole, as opposed to looking at agriculture and the supply side. And that was important because it allowed us to open up issues like food loss and waste, and also the sensitive issues, which we acknowledge as sensitive, of dietary choices. And if I was going to sum it up, where the key advances need to be made, it's all about interdisciplinarity and joining up. And that for us has 2 dimensions. One, how do we coordinate within IPCC? And then how do we coordinate with other assessments where there are interface kinds of issues? So one thing I would flag up with the special report on climate change in land is that we didn't distinguish strongly between adaptation and mitigation. We actually looked at measures that had adaptation and mitigation consequences and looked at them in a systematic way. So things like soil management, agricultural practices have consequences in both dimensions. I'll say the other thing, when we got onto our working group reports, there was a lot more collaboration between the working groups in the last cycle than there had ever been. And just to say, we had, for example, the innovation of cross-working group boxes, so the same material would appear in more than one working group report. So there was a cross-working group box on mitigation and adaptation via the bioeconomy, which was wider than the food system, but it included very strong food system elements within it. And I think that was really very, very helpful. And just to say, the next set of working group co-chairs for the 7th cycle are already very enthusiastic about working together and may even do a better and more thorough job on it than we did in AR6. So they're already thinking about material that might cut across the working groups, that goes beyond boxes, might, for example, be shared chapters on particular topics. And actually, agri-food systems is a classic kind of topic that would lend itself to that cross-working group collaboration. Now, just to say, on links with other assessments, you know, when I was making my case to be IPCC chair, I made a strong case for stronger links with other assessments like IPBES. And I'm assured you're supposed to pronounce it IPBES. David, the chair, has given me that authoritative pronouncement on how to actually do it. But just to say, there are other linkages as well. For example, with the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD, which has a science policy interface inside it. And certainly I took the results of the special report on climate change and land to a UNCCD COP as well. So issues like land degradation neutrality are other concepts that we need to pay attention to. Now, just to say, as a kind of expectations management issue, we can't really, within our current principles and procedures, do shared common reports with other assessments. But there are other lots of softer initiatives in which we can make a lot of progress. Things like glossaries, definitions, potentially scenarios, authors that cut across different reports, reviewing each other's reports. There's lots and lots of ways in which we can take it forward. So I was asked about priorities, and I just conscious of the fact I haven't mentioned any in spite of the 3 or 4 minutes, but I think the context is important. But just to say, I do think priorities are continuing this theme of looking at adaptation and mitigation together rather than considering them separately. The links with biodiversity and food security and collaboration with other assessments is obvious. I know something in which IPC has got a lot of criticism on, more realistic modelling at the global scale of I think, some of the initiatives. I would say that finance in the agri-food sector is also extremely important. The gaps are much larger, say, than they are for renewable energy. And I personally am very enthusiastic about the agenda of understanding what works, ex-post evaluation of policies and interventions to understand, which would be really helpful, I think, for policymakers. But I'll bring this round to a halt here. Thanks, Aditi.
Thanks so much, Jim. That was a fantastic set of response and very much along the lines that we were thinking, particularly around finance, because actually less than 1% finance comes to this sector, and even a smaller proportion to the smallholder farmers with whom we work, and they are the most vulnerable. So thanks so much, Jim. Now my question is now to Dr. David Obura. So David, again, agriculture and biodiversity are closely linked, and not always in good ways, as agriculture is often the leading cause for biodiversity loss. So as the newly elected chair of the IPBES, I take Jim's word that that's the right way to pronounce it, but you can tell us IPBES or IPBES. So again, what are the main knowledge gaps around agriculture and biodiversity that scientists like us needs to fill, you know, for you to be able to use for the next, for us to use for the next assessment cycle? Then additionally, do you have any special report on agriculture and biodiversity plan within the IPBES cycle? So over to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Aditi, and good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be here as the chair of IPBES. We do have a video that tells us how to pronounce it from our communications department, so please go to the website and you can find that. But yeah, so IPBES, how do we look at agriculture? So IPBES has a very integrated framework for looking at people and nature together. We have a conceptual framework that was developed early on in the process. And in this, we identify nature's contributions to people as our primary sort of, I suppose, the framework for looking at how we interact with nature. And of the 18 NCPs, as we call them, foods and food provisioning is one of those. And so agriculture, or the provisioning of food, is really one of the foundations that we look at. And because of this integrated framework, we don't separate it from other aspects. Of course, how food is produced is of critical importance. And there you go into the whole food systems approach and thinking about food systems and culture and values that people have, as opposed to just food production and agriculture. So we do have this very broad framing of how we're approaching it. Agriculture or food production was quite widely considered in the global assessment that was done, that was produced in 2019. And in the summary for policymakers, there's a number of statements on the importance of agriculture as the most important driver of land use change and therefore of impacts to biodiversity, but also then the potential for transformations and for positive ways of interacting with nature in the production of food. The other real foundation of the IPBES conceptual framework is the multiple values and different perspectives that different cultures and people have of the nature around them and how food production and other activities evolve in local environments. So there's a multiplicity of ways. There's no one single way to consider food production. And the importance of really, I guess, understanding that in moving away from the dominant system of food production which we've had, which has essentially tried to maximize the volume of production of food without necessarily looking at the quality of food or the diversity of food, undermining genetic diversity in crops, undermining the use of multiple species of food sources that underpin many cultures around the world. So that's really a key foundation. In terms of knowledge gaps and moving forward, so we currently have the Nexus assessment that is under production. In fact, one of the co-chairs of the assessment, Dr. Pam McElwee, is here in the room, and she's also well known in IPCC circles as an author who goes across the two systems, and so demonstrating what Jim was just mentioning about the value of authors crossing the assessments, crossing the SPIs to get this cross-fertilization. And in the Nexus assessment, we were charged through our procedures of looking at 5 main elements, so biodiversity, climate change, but then also food, water, and health as 5 Nexus elements that really sort of perhaps a mini SDG framing of how we interact with the world and the many ways in which we're utilizing nature and impacting nature and need to transform to move towards sustainable pathways for future development. So in that chapter on food, we take a very broad approach, looking at, in the next assessment, really looking at response options, what are solutions that actors can implement in moving forward in more sustainable ways. And so across the methodology we've chosen in the report is to identify many different response options, prioritize 15 of those, and then really do a deep dive on 5. And we try and show the diverse ways in which agriculture, food production, can integrate with other Nexus elements. So we look very much at agriculture and ecological interactions together, particularly of agroecology as well, as a discipline, an approach to really integrating production with nature. And the broad breadth of benefits and the values from diversification in systems. And critically important in looking to the future also is the agency and rights that people have in ensuring that sort of cultural and intellectual property and considerations are really at the foundations of transformations and moving forward, and the knowledge gaps in how we do that. And that gets picked up in the transformative change assessment, which also is being developed in parallel with the Nexus assessment. Both of them, we hope, will come out in December 2024 at the next IPBES plenary. So in terms of future assessments and further addressing challenges with agriculture, or food systems, and biodiversity, IPBES has a rolling work program in which we have identified a number of reports that sort of feed from one to the next, and one set of findings feeds into the priorities we identify in subsequent ones. So, as I mentioned, we have the Nexus and Transformative Change currently ongoing. Business and biodiversity assessment has started up as well, and that, of course, a component of that will relate to agricultural business. We have been given the task of undertaking a second global assessment, and the scoping for that second global assessment is just starting up now. We have a roster of experts that we're selecting from, and we'll have a scoping workshop in April. So hopefully this can, provides an opportunity to consider with the AR7 scoping process how we can move forward and what interlinkages we can operationalize in bringing the work across the platforms together, and of course with food systems platforms as well. And then lastly, I'll mention another fast-track assessment we have requested through the Global Biodiversity Framework process is one on spatial planning for Target 1 of the GBF, and of course with the importance of agriculture and food systems on land use. That is also going to be a key way for us to really help identify how we can monitor the impacts and also the positive aspects of food systems and land use change with biodiversity. So I'll end with that and look forward to questions afterwards. Thank you, Aditi.
Yeah. Thanks so much, David. Again, important points also around the various knowledge systems. So this is actually was also a question that I had for Diana. IPCC assessments, Diana, particularly, we rely primarily on scientific peer-reviewed papers. So AR6 did try to bring in also indigenous knowledge, etc. But in the food space, particularly, a lot of the innovations are happening via indigenous community or civil society, which do not necessarily, get published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. So what are your thoughts for the AR7 cycle as the vice chair to capture those kinds of knowledge products? I mean, particularly because IPBES also has a good tradition around capturing those kind of knowledge products. So yeah, over to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Aditi, and thank you very much for this very prestigious invitation. I do hope that you can hear me well because my internet seems to be not the most perfect. In any case, okay, very good. So yes, Aditi, these are really excellent questions. And I think this is where, although there are lots of good news, but the real challenges are still ahead of us. So the good news part of it is that indeed, as you mentioned, I think in the 6th assessment report, we have already placed quite a lot of emphasis on incorporating the voices of indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge systems. For example, the whole opening of the 3rd assessment, report of Working Group 3 was with referring to indigenous peoples. Actually, it happened to be on Indigenous Peoples Day. So definitely we are placing a lot of emphasis on that, but there are definitely a lot of challenges left. And with those, let me first turn to actually something which is not necessary yet about indigenous systems, but already challenges our discussions on agriculture as the enemy, as this whole panel was starting. What we have already done in the 6th assessment report, we have shown that, in fact, just a small share of the population is responsible for a very large share of the emissions, and vice versa. The large share of the population is responsible for very little of the emissions. And while we have actually quantify this for several sectors, I'm not sure if, because we are talking about knowledge gaps, I'm not sure if we have adequately quantified this for the agriculture sector and food system sector. Because, for example, being in Dubai, I think that illustrates really well how the conspicuous consumption of the elites, the global elites, actually place a much higher burden, also food system related, not only emissions, but biodiversity impacts, than just meeting the basic needs of the vast majority of the global population. For example, in our model on buildings, we have already showed that even if we just don't touch the poorer half of the population, especially those who are still living in slums, to upgrade their homes and their shelter to a higher level, actually you would not really see any impact in the global emissions. And especially because the growth of the top 10%, those emissions are going to grow so much more than this that it's almost unnoticeable. So I think we need to do also the similar robust assessment for food systems. But that brings me back also to the knowledge systems, because as you already pointed out, we still have a long way to go in order to be able to assess all different knowledge systems. Right now, it's not only the IPCC, but in general, the global scientific establishment is really biased towards one type of knowledge system, and it's mainly the Anglo-Saxon academic establishment, how knowledge systems and evaluations and just general what counts as scientific excellence has been established. But we see that that is much more difficult, makes it much more difficult to integrate other knowledge systems, because even if we manage to tick all the boxes on diversity in terms of the authors, the geographical distribution, the gender distribution, the disciplinary distribution, which IPCC has become very good at. Nevertheless, we still see that in the end, in the final products, the voices of not all of these communities, even though they sit fairly equally already now at the table, their voices are not equally shared. It is because very often they are working in a different type of scientific community, a different knowledge system, and it's very difficult for them to genuinely incorporate their knowledge into the product. So it is, while we have made actually quite a good advance on how to approach indigenous knowledge systems, I think we still need to be much more inclusive for a diversity of other knowledge systems. And definitely we still also have a very far way to go also for really better incorporating indigenous knowledge systems, because the way how we are now incorporating is still fairly biased, because those members of them who speak a good English, who can contribute well, but that already means they are not, they have certain biases. So the final good news, this was all the bad news and the challenges that we are facing. The good news is that the IPBES is going to host an expert meeting on gender diversity and inclusivity. And in that, I hope that we will be able to tackle this question as well. And we will lay the foundations for how to be much more diverse in the types of knowledge systems that we integrate and we include in our reports. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Diana. And those were, again, incredibly important sets of comments. And actually that brings us your point around lack of equity and the very fact that it's really the top 1% and the top 10%, and most of us are present there right now in that meeting, are the causes of emissions, and it's not really the bottom 90%, is absolutely correct. And that brings us to our next speaker, George, who represents the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support Group. And Africa as a whole, as we know, assessment shows, has historically contributed to only 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions, but is particularly vulnerable to climate change because of all kinds of inherent vulnerabilities. So given that, my question to you, George, is what is the ask of African research communities who support climate negotiations at the COPs from these global scientific assessments, both IPCC as well as IPBES? Over to you, George. What is it that will make your life as negotiators easier? What kind of evidence and support you are looking from these processes to be able to negotiate on behalf of the continent?
Yeah, thanks. From negotiations perspective, we value science. There's no doubt about that. Because for any position that we have to advance, we must have a background information that helps us to explain why we're taking that particular position. And this has been evolving for many years, and I must thank CG, because we started working with CG since 2012, and in all our preparatory meetings, the CG are represented, and we invite them to share their knowledge products with a view of helping us to deal with those issues that are at hand. Now, one of the key things that we realize is that many of our countries have very ambitious NDCs, national determined contributions, very aspirational. But when we try to ask them to unpack them into what we would call investment plans and ask them, can you tell us the climate rationale for that, then we get a gap, big gap. So you find that many of our countries go back to rightly traditional ways without bearing in mind that they will need to justify why what they're saying has a climate angle. And what is that climate angle that needs to be addressed that is enhancing vulnerability? And that is the issue that we do look out to the scientists and experts to help us. The second issue, which for us we have found very useful, is traditionally over the years we've had scientists working in silos. So they tell us this, and then somebody else comes in and tells us this, and another one. And so when now we are trying to analyze, then we realize, but there's some contradictions in between, and therefore we must find what will be the most appropriate. And it's on that basis that we were happy with the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, which looks at the nexus approach. For example, water, energy, food, ecosystems, and health. For us, that is the reality. That's what our countries are facing, and therefore enables us to, when we're negotiating, to look at what we are planning or what we're proposing, how does it translate into the actual systems on the ground. And so we would encourage that the nexus approach, those interfaces, and particularly the biodiversity and ecosystems is very critical for us, because as you know, in Africa, our people rely on natural resources for their livelihood. And therefore, when we're talking about agriculture, and we know that we say agriculture is the devil in that it contributes to biodiversity loss. And I recall when we were negotiating RED Plus, when we tried to tell them they include agriculture, they told us, no, we don't. But we had to be clever and say, okay, you have to, as part of safeguards, you'll have to deal with the drivers of deforestation. And in that process, then it meant that they'll have to deal with agriculture, because agriculture is a driver of deforestation. So we need to look at all those linkages to enable us to be able to engage. But one critical issue right now, which we are facing and which we are trying to address as Agnes working with the AU member states, is how do we translate those aspirations in their NDCs and NAPs into implementable investment plans that can actually catalyze and unlock investments. Now, finally, the point I want to, the challenge I want to throw to the scientists is, as we do all this, where do we bring in the private sector? Because private sector, they have their own way of doing things. And so they will not read our 300 pages of IPCC or even the summary that you provide. And I think since we are now saying that we recognize the importance of private sector, I think it may be useful to look at what will be the appropriate knowledge products that can be tailored to inform and engage the private sector so that they can see the opportunities which they can hook on and implement the climate action. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. So what I take away from you is that what you need, the science is in much more actionable format, more integrated and more actionable that policymakers can work on, and also inspire private sector to take action. I think those are absolutely excellent points. So now I come to Dr. Isfahane, and given that she has recently taken on the charge of being our executive managing director, and CGIAR is one of the world's largest publicly funded agricultural research organization. And so Isfahane, you heard about the knowledge gaps and you heard about the request from our partners like AGNIS. So in that context, what do you think our role needs to be to ensure that both IPCC and IPBES assessments capture the latest scientific field, and also making sure that voices of our partners find space? So basically a bit of direction setting in which way our research into this space should go into.
Thank you, Aditya, and I'm happy I'm coming after all the interventions to hear the different perspective. And maybe what we should remind ourselves is that nature does not separate between disciplines, does not know what IPCC and IPBES and CGIAR and AGNIS is, and think that's what we need to do when we talk with policymakers. We tend to sectorial, to put things in section, and it does underplay the trades-off. It does underplay the synergies as well. So we lose both on the opportunity side, and we lose also on the solution side. And I think really it's nice to see that scientists, at least, they go between the different committees, they publish together, and I think if we can elevate that to the sectorial discussion, that will be very useful. So I'm very happy from our perspective that the CGIAR scientists we have many scientists that are very dedicated to the climate change, and hence they are part and parcel of IPCC publications. Same with IPBES, and same working with the negotiators to some extent. But I think what we need to look at, in my perspective, it's a little bit disappointing that agri-food system, it's now part of the discussion. So it means 27 COPs, we were not part of it, or we were at it at a very small scale. It is very disappointing as well that we don't have enough data to showcase many things that we know as scientists. One of them is really the synergies, and the fact that if you want to tackle food security, nutrition security, you can do it without tackling climate and biodiversity. We don't have enough data to look at the impact at the local level. For example, and the combination, or sometimes the dichotomy, like I was talking to a livestock person, and she told me that the cows that produce the least actually emit the most per liter. So this dichotomy shows you that our intervention points are very clear. So if we go to Africa today, and if we increase productivity in Africa through a sustainable way, not a bad way, so we go to those cows where we have the least productivity. So we increase production of milk that people need, but we reduce the methane, because if we don't do it this way, there will be much more cows on the ground. If we go to crops, for example, we know that the yield gap in Africa, it's about 10% of what's produced in the north. If we address it now, we could produce more with less. So it's a little bit disturbing to know that the solutions are known, but that the finance does not follow, the investment does not follow. And the why it doesn't follow, it's because economically it's not the best for the people that are winning right now. I always say if we go outside the planet and we see ourselves from up there, they're gonna think we're crazy. They're gonna really, I mean, if I was an extraterrestrial, and maybe I am, but in the next generation or the next years or the next life. So it's because we are moving things in a very erratic way. We have models that might not be, that are for sure not the best for the planet, but they are still continuing. And that's where I think IPCC, IPBES, IPBES, yeah, IPBES. I need to see the video, yeah? IPBES. And all of us, we need really to think it at the system level, and we need to come with good solutions. And I know that science and innovation and data and linking the points together is very important, and that's where I think CGIAR has to play a role. Not only on talking about a particular commodity or a particular agri-food system, but really engaging with all of you guys to bring a narrative that will help Kenya to take the right decision, that will help this country and that country and the global. And I think we have that capacity in us. What we need to do is really be frank, put the things together, and bring solution. And that's where private sector is a must. I don't see us doing it without private sector at all. Not because they have the money, which many people, yes, we agree, most of the money is in the private sector. No, it's because actually they are the only one that can scale it up at a level that will mean something. They are the only one that can really get us from a few thousand to millions. And also because they are the ones that are emitting the most. When we talk about climate impact, if we have again that data, I'm sure they will stop moving the stuff the way they are moving it right now. And I want to just to close to say that, and those all, Aditi, are really knowledge gap that we can clarify as CGIAR with the partners. WTO says that any commodity cross a border at least twice. So it means some of them cross 3-4 times. And that data and the logistic behind it has to be addressed. And we need data, and we need to work with the private sector to convince them that there is a better way to do it, and it is still economically viable. I hope it is economically viable, but we have to showcase it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ismahani, and I think it's critical that science delivers the knowledge gaps that this panel has been discussing. I'm a bit aware about that we are running a bit short on time. We did start a little later than scheduled, but I had a list of second round of questions, which I'm going to request all of you 1 minute of time. The second round of question was really about diversity in science, and Diana has answered that already. The question is that we know that the solutions have to be diverse. There are no global solutions per se, particularly in this space. It has to be very context specific, and we have to have a whole range of diversity of voices, included diversity of perspective, knowledge systems. So my question to Jim is around what are the plans for AR7 to continue with the good work that AR6 has started? From David, my question was around IPBES had done a great job in indigenous knowledge, inclusion of indigenous knowledge, if there are lessons that others can draw. From George, my question was, how does he foresee more African scientists involved in this process? And from Ismahan, again, my question was around how can CG promote more diversity in science and voices? So if each one of you can take a minute each to talk about this particular way, because unless the diverse voices are heard, our solutions will be incomplete solutions, not suitable for every community that we want to serve. So maybe start with Jim, David, George, and Ismahan.
Yeah, okay, very quickly, and that's a big set of questions for 1 minute, but let me do my best. Just to say, we did make a lot of progress in the 6th cycle. There were more developing country authors than developed country authors in the special report on climate change and land, which was on the basis of scientific merit, I should say. And we are learning little techniques for how you can get better diversity when you search the spreadsheets of nominations. I'll quickly say challenges for the future, not just balances between regions, but balances within regions so that single countries do not necessarily dominate the author list, including decision makers in scoping meetings and author lists, as well as pure scientists. And we have a big issue around indigenous knowledge and how to integrate it. And there I think we can actually learn from IPBES. You know, some people do it better than us, but we have been having meetings with the local communities and indigenous peoples platform here at COP28. And I just, one other thing to say, we started a scheme for developing country chapter scientists to take part in the Working Group 3 report in the last cycle. And I'm working in the background with philanthropies and other people to see if we can extend that more widely as we go into AR7.
Thanks, Jim. So I'll just be quick on IPBES. So we do some of the same sort of author procedures for diversity and representation from around the world. But I will focus on the indigenous and local knowledge component because IPBES has invested very strongly in that. And I mean, the simple answer is just ask, which we didn't tend to do as scientists in the past. We would run ahead with our ideas and thinking we had all the information. But there are different knowledges and there are different ways, there are very strong ways to go about inclusiveness, and it's about justice. We often think about distributional justice, but it's very important to have procedural and recognitional justice as well, very formally embedded into processes. So we invest a lot in that. Dialogues for all the assessments with indigenous knowledge holders, and we're trying to build up ways to engage with practitioners as well. Particularly in the Nexus assessment, for example, which is very much around practical applications. So the investment in diversity and in being very inclusive is very important, and I think many global processes are realizing that and doing it much better. We have the tools to do it now much better than we did before in terms of the communications and data and information being able to flow and people be able to express themselves to a much broader audience as well. So I think this is areas which we will only improve as we move forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Aditi. Yeah, with respect to what we're doing, in April this year, we did actually convene a meeting of the national IPCC national focal points with some lead authors in Nairobi. And we were discussing how do we enhance collaboration between the scientists and national focal points, because they seem to be not communicating. And secondly, learning from AR6, we wanted to know what are those knowledge gaps that were identified in AR6 that we need to move to AR7, which are critical for Africa. And we already have mapped out those areas. And as a result, we were requested to establish a database. We already have now a database of over 800 scientists, and it became very easy when a call came from IPCC for the scoping of the cities and the rest. We were able to use that list to get many of them to apply. And I can tell you, we did have regional meetings for Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, and West Africa. And we just like what the IPCC chair has said, dominance of countries can be a problem, because most of the authors in Africa actually come from South Africa and primarily University of Cape Town. And so we're trying to see how do we spread across that. So yes, that is one of our priorities, and we're going to have the follow-up meeting in February next year, which then will be, the intention is we want to get as many African experts in that space, and I hope David will get to that line also. And more importantly, we are also trying to get some of those areas that have been identified as gaps. How do we get our universities to start doing some work, so that by the time we're doing the assessment, we should have some knowledge products can feed into that. So yes, we are committed to that, and we are looking forward to enhancing the numbers of African experts in the knowledge product systems, particularly the IPCC.
So Aditi, is it me
Thanks.
or Diana?
I mean, either of you. And
Go ahead, Diana,
take
please.
Very small time. Yes.
Thank you very much. Just very quickly to complement what Jim has said, we are very good at the numbers already. Nevertheless, sometimes it was a major effort on behalf of the Bureau because simply it was difficult from the nominations to come up with actually a balanced set of authors. So I want to throw back the ball actually on your court, on the audience's court, that you will have to make sure that we will have very balanced nominations. First of all, much more nominations from the Global South, but also I think within countries, it's really important to have a more balanced set of nominations. Each and every country makes sure that their nominations are balanced in terms of gender and diverse knowledge communities and disciplinary and so on, it will be much easier for us also to be balanced. But another really important point is, so you should prepare now, we will have in the next 2-3 years, lots of calls for nominations of authors and experts. So we really appreciate if you help us making sure that we really can be diverse and inclusive. The other point is that it's not only about authorship, it's also about reviewing. It's really important. Review part is very important part of our process. We really need to make sure that also the reviewers contribute from all around the world, from all different knowledge systems, because this is also often just a privilege of the richest part of richest institutions. So if you can all help institutionally and in the diverse ways, that we really get a very inclusive and diverse and wide range of reviewers and review comments representing different knowledge systems, that will definitely help us ensure really being able to capture the diversity of voices and perspectives. Thank you.
And Aditi, from my side, only 2 quick points. One of them is that the CGIAR works a lot with National Agricultural Research System and local academias. So really, we are very close to the scientific communities in the South, with our 15 centers being in the South. And maybe the other point is that we have to be intentional about that. We have to put targets. We need to have this percentage in gender, this percentage in the Global South. It's very important that we are intentional about it. And my last point, it's 3, not 2, is really that with the new AI and the new data mining in different languages, in different magazines, I think we need to use technology. I know that peer-reviewed journals, it's very important, but maybe if we go to the gray publications, we use AI and mining data in multiple languages, it will help us really to get more Global South representation. Thank you, Aditi.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for this very, very interesting discussion. And I think all that we were hoping to achieve, we have been able to generate those discussions. And we are running a little behind time. And so I will now pass on to our last speaker, who would provide us with the closing remarks. That's His Royal Highness Prince Hamid de Bourbon de Parma, who is the climate envoy for the Netherlands and is passionate around the cause of climate change. Yeah, so over to you, Your Royal Highness.
Thank you very much. No, it's wonderful to be with you and with all the acronyms that it's interesting the scientists are not the best marketeers. I'm the climate envoy, so I'm one of the users of your information. It's the politicians, it's the diplomat like myself, and it's the climate negotiators here at the COP. And mirrors are made with glass, which is transparent, and silver in the past, that reflects, and you're giving us a reflection in a way forward. So it's very good to be here with CGIAR, or whatever you want to pronounce it, IPCC and IPBES. I now know how to pronounce it, and congratulations that you brought us together. Climate scientists and agricultural scientists live on the same planet, but live in different worlds. And we see some cross-pollination here, which is quite helpful, and that needs to continue. Now, food systems are both the culprits and the victims of climate change, and we've discussed that here. At this COP, in COP 27, or 26, my first COP in Glasgow, food was a side issue. Last year in Egypt, it was a full day, agriculture. And now it's central in the program. It's actually food systems. And the Food System Declaration was signed, and that means that food can be introduced into NDCs, and that needs to be pushed. 136 countries signed that, and we need to increase that, and also the knowledge how to actually incorporate it. So the private sector is another off-taker of all your knowledge that you're doing here. Now, vulnerability is increasing. we see maize, wheat, rice, all these other staple crops are very climate sensitive. And The Guardian just published yesterday a report that with only moving from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius, only half a degree difference, will lead in West Africa to a 40 to 50% decrease in maize sale. So that's in the period between 2030 and 2070. And the same period, the population is set to double. So we're looking at a situation with a catastrophic potential for hunger. And where will people go? They'll cut down nature, then encroach even more in nature to be able to survive. So that's a downward spiral also for climate change and biodiversity loss. So yes, if we convince Brazil and the rest of the world to produce less food for livestock and more for people, you can cushion some of it. But it's a big challenge. And of course, it's not just about the quantity of food, but also the quality and nutrition going forward. Now, I'm also concerned about multiple food breadbasket failure. And when we talk about climate scientists and food production, that's coming together. I got a presentation where you see where the Gulf Stream is making more loops. You can have more pockets of heat, and that can be precisely in the food producing areas. In 2010, we had a kind of a precursor for that, and that could happen more often. So that's not just bad for food production, but also availability, because we only have a couple of traders in the world, and the food price will spike up if there's something like that happening. So making it even more difficult for countries to access it and have the political instability that comes with it. Now, we see with IPCC, it's giving us a clear way forward on mitigation. I love the slat where we see where on energy, on food and agriculture, on transportation, on industry and others, there is clear lines where you say where is it most impactful and what's blue, cost effective, and what is more expensive. That gives a clear line for the world, clear line for countries, for individuals, and for each company to see a map where the most effective things you can do. We don't have that yet for food, so we need to develop that, and that can only be done, I think, in collaboration between both of you. Now, just to end. I had a panel yesterday, I opened Food Day, and there was a panel, and someone from the private sector, surprisingly, said, do we need to do something about climate? Yes. Do we need to do something about biodiversity? Absolutely. Do we need to do something for farmers? Yes. But he said, let's turn it around. Let's do something for farmers, because 80% of the food comes from farmers. And the farmers need to be able to produce that doesn't affect biodiversity, and to help to produce, not to have a negative effect on climate. And then all these pictures around this in this table, in the food pavilion, it's these people we need to put front and center and support, and then build up from the bottom up solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a very wonderful panel, and it's a huge task to sum it up in short. But what we really discussed at the end of it is that there are solutions, there are options, but those solutions and options have to really work for the smallholder farmers who produce most of our food, without compromising, without making our climate crisis worse, and without further reducing our biodiversity. And we know all three are very closely related: food security, biodiversity, and climate change. So there is a need to work closely together. So with that, thank you so much to all the panelists, and for the excellent audience for this session. And yes, so this is the end of this session, and see you again, and we'll keep engaged. Yes, bye. Bye, Diana.